Welcome back to Government 148. Last segment we were discussing George W. Bush's foreign policy adjustment in the aftermath of the 9/11 attack. And if you recall, we mentioned that he had to decide how to respond and to what extent that would necessitate changes in the United States foreign policy. One of the ways to be able to better explain that, I suggested, was to trace the changes that were going to take place in the way the Holy Trinity in the post-Cold War era was going to get implemented. So that's what we did in the last class, and the conclusion was that it was finally decided that it would make the most sense for us to change the third interest in the Holy Trinity, which was support for the autocratic regimes that were our allies, and identify that one as the cause of our problems. So I'm going to begin with that portion of our discussion now. And in a sense, that whole debate, the foreign policy debate, amounted to making the following choices. The choice, on the one hand, between the pursuit of our economic and commercial interest versus the articulation or creation of a new foreign policy that would truly reflect our values, our democratic principles. So the stark choice that confronted the George W. Bush administration was the so-called interest versus principles. Again, remember now, the interest here mostly refers to our commercial and economic interest, and this relates primarily to our third interest in the post-Cold War Holy Trinity, support for the conservative Arab regimes. Now, framing the foreign policy options in this way, in some ways made it very easy for us to continue our support for the state of Israel, because now we could dump on the autocratic Arab allies and make us feel good about it, because after all, we were living up to our principles. Moreover, when you think about it, it could be argued that Israel, along with Turkey, were arguably the only democratic states in all of Middle East. So the solution, or if you like, the remedy to this dilemma, to this foreign policy dilemma, was simply to push what President Bush called the freedom agenda. In other words, it amounted to changing the direction of United States Middle East policy, dumping on our erstwhile allies, the so-called, what the people we love to call moderate responsibles, for example, Egypt, Mubarak of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, all the Gulf monarchies. And to do that, it would amount to turning a new page in our foreign policy. And this new page is what was called the freedom agenda. Now, the analogy that the Bush administration really had in mind in creating this new policy was really one of contagion. In other words, this was supposed to become a contagious spread of ideas and values. Once the seeds of democracy and liberty were properly planted in the Middle East, then our expectation was that it would go viral throughout the region, and it would infect, so to speak, all these countries, and it would spread liberty all over the area. So with the new direction charted in January of 2002, President Bush delivered his famous Axis of Evil speech during the State of the Union address to the Americans. And in that speech, he named Iran actually, and North Korea as the main sources of world's evil and the main problem with what's going on in the world. Never mind that North Korea is not even in the Middle East, and Iran and Iraq are really sworn enemies of each other. If you recall the Iran-Iraq war, there was no love lost between these two nations. So we have these disparate trios that had not anything to do with 9/11. And when you look at the world geography, they don't even form an axis on the world map. In short, lumping the three together made little, if any, sense. So what happened next was that in the short run, the freedom agenda was a good catchphrase to rationalize, to legitimize this new direction of our foreign policy, but also after the speech, the Axis of Evil, it also allowed President Bush to justify for himself, at least, or to rationalize for himself, to bring about, to effect a regime change in Iraq by getting rid of Saddam Hussein. And I must point out that to bring about a regime change in Iraq, to overthrow or get rid of Saddam Hussein, was already a wish on the part of the president, which predates a 9/11 attack. From the very early time that he came to power, many of President or several of President Bush's advisors, senior advisor, brought about this issue of getting rid of Saddam Hussein. He was the source of evil, and then the 9/11 really made it easy for him to do that. So therefore, Saddam was now a perfect guinea pig for testing this new freedom agenda, this new policy. After all, he was by far one of the most detestable, one of the most repressive and hated dictators in the Middle East, so he would make a very good target. So in spite of very strong opposition from much of the world, and also on the part of most of our European allies, especially France, and without proper United Nations backing, in March 20th, 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, and that invasion was very fittingly dubbed Operation Iraqi Freedom. So we have this U.S. now invading Iraq. Within a few months, actually within a month almost, April 9th, what we had seen was a very, very swift military victory. I should just add that the resistance was barely in existence. The Iraqi soldiers had learned from their experience with the United States forces back in 1991, when close to 100,000 of them got killed, that they're not going to stay as a sitting duck. As soon as the invasion began, many of the Iraqi soldiers, they took out their uniforms and they went back to the cities as civilians. So the defeat was without much of a fight, really. And also, I should point out, back in 1991, we had already destroyed 98% of Iraqis' weapons. So on May 1st of 2003, a couple of months after the invasion, President Bush gave a very smug speech about the success of the war on the deck of the United States ship Abraham Lincoln. Hanging behind him was that ominous, quote, "mission accomplished" banner, which haunted him really for the remainder of his presidency. The victory euphoria proved to be short-lived as United States became an occupying power soon after it being a liberating power, and the occupation began to creep into a very bloody quagmire. So the occupation soon morphed into this disastrous outcome. In the meantime, President Bush moved ahead with his new policy toward the Middle East, and this time he wanted to make sure everyone fully understand that this is a policy not just for Iraq, but that he has discovered the correct policy, how to change all of Middle East. So President Bush's policy was now called Forward Strategy of Freedom, and this was pretty much a reflection of his vision for the greater Middle East, which he articulated under this Greater Middle East Initiative. And the Greater Middle East Initiative actually really embraced all of Middle East, but also included Afghanistan and perhaps even Pakistan. Now, the most important element of this vision was what was earlier referred to as the democracy agenda. And the democracy agenda was deemed so important that even if that would have required overthrowing regime, or more politely, to engage in regime changes, that was considered acceptable. So the idea also was that Iraq, our guinea pig, would be a superb model once the success of Iraq is seen to justify this forward strategy of freedom. So for President Bush, there was every reason to believe that the post-Saddam Iraq will become that elusive model for Middle East, and how America will be able to change that whole entire region. Never did we ask ourselves whether or not such a undertaking was even within the realm of our capability. And it's somewhat ironic that Republicans who believe government is so incompetent that they're not even capable of changing the school system in this country, somehow they believe that the same government is capable of completely overhauling an entire region, embracing close to 700-800 million people. But the fact remained that at least for the first couple of years,